Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss how the Indian sources, particularly Sanskrit sources of early medieval period. So we are talking about the period of 8th century AD to 14th century, 15th century AD. So during this period, the Sanskrit sources, how these Sanskrit sources have described the Arabs and the Turks. So basically, we are going to look at two different aspects. We are first going to talk about what are the terminologies that are used to describe these Arabs and later the Turks, and also what are some of the qualities that are attributed to this group. Now, what we will do is we will talk about some basic aspect of how the early invasions took place. So, as I think most of you would know, but I think it is better to revise this. So the early caliphates around 650 AD, we see that Sassanid Empire has been destroyed, and the region of Oxus and Hindu Kush up until this time, the caliphate armies has reached this area. So for those of you who know about this, this region was under the influence of, you can say, Indian culture. So this was the period from 650 onwards. We can say that there was a direct, indirect interaction between these two cultures. But when we move to south of the Oxus in Kabul, particularly the present day Afghanistan, so we are talking about, so in present day Afghanistan, there were two important kingdoms. So the kingdom of Kabul and the kingdom of Zabul. Zabul is southern Afghanistan, which presently includes the district of Zabul and Ghazni. So in these two kingdoms, there are some aspects. Some scholars are of the opinion that there was an identical Hindu. They were worshipping Hindus, or some believe that the royal court or the royal house was attached to a particular deity, but the masses were Buddhist. So whatever may be the case, but what we can say is that the region of Afghanistan during this period was Indianized. So what we see is that, after conquering this Hindu Kush region, the caliphate armies did try to push into Afghanistan. And what we see is that around the start of 8th century, so around 700 to 714, they were able to, capture this region. But what we see is that up until the 9th century, so completely from 700 onwards, we see that there was constant struggle. So one time the Arabs would come and they would replace these rulers, then these rulers would revolt. So it was only around the end of 9th century that this whole Afghanistan region was completely conquered. But when we move to Sindh, we find that the Arabs did try to invade this region around 643 AD, and this invasion was a naval invasion. Now, in the sources we have, and I think most of us know that there is Chachnama, which we can call it an Indian source, but it was not written. It was written by Arab or a person who claims to be of Arab descent, and it was written quite late. But even in Chachnama, we are told that in this expedition, the Arabs were defeated. But on the when we read Arabic sources, we are told that Muslims were able to gain significant success. But I think this is not true. The Arabs were defeated in this expedition. But the main attempt happened around 707 to 8, when you see Al-Hajjaj was his name, who was became the governor of Iraq, and he deployed I think most of us know about Mohammed Bin Qasim. So it was during it was in under his command that Sindh was conquered. So this was the period around 711 to 712. So what we see is that Mohammed Bin Qasim has conquered the region of Sindh, and this conquest, if you have to look at it, the lower Indus region, so the region up to Multan was conquered by the Arab. But what we see is that after 714, so there is this, what we see is that Al-Hajjaj, who was the backer of Mohammed Bin Qasim, he was replaced, and later we see that Mohammed Qasim was also replaced. So the new commander of this region was a person called Junaid, and during the command of Junaid, we see that raids were we call it raids, but I think it is hard for us to say whether these were small raids or there were attempts made to conquer deep into India, because the period from 724 to 738, there are multiple inscriptions in Indian sources that talks about that Malechas or other terminologies that were used for the Arabs, that they were defeated. So what we see is that in the India proper per se, there is great raids were made, and sometimes we can call it raids, or we can also call it attempts to conquest were made from 724 AD. And what we see is that the major one major invasion that happened. So in this invasion, we see that the Arabs managed to reach up to Ujjain. And here we are told there is this inscription in Gwalior by the Gurjar Pratihar king Nagbhatt I, who tells us that he defeated the Malecha king. So the fact that the Arab armies were able to reach Ujjain, and in this way they had to cross the Rajputana region or Rajasthan region. So the fact that they managed to invade this deep into India, it suggests that this was not a normal invasion. It was not a normal raid. They had intended to conquer this region, but ultimately this did not happen. So this is a some broad overview, because the inscriptions which talk about the defeat of the Arabs use the term Tajik. So Tajik is used in 2-3 inscriptions and more inscriptions, which tells us that the particular person has defeated a Tajik army. So first we will talk about how this term came from. So this term Tajik, according to some scholars, comes from the Pahlavi word Tazig. So Pahlavi, I think, is a middle, we all know is Middle Persian. So this Middle Persian word Tazig was itself derived from the name of an Arab tribe, which is Tai. So this Tai which is the name of an Arab tribe, becomes Tajik in Pahlavi, and from this Tajik, the Indians borrow this term and we make it Tajika. So, but there are some scholars who do not agree with this debate, but what is important is that this Tajik term is used. So what we see is that there is, the first reference to this term Tajik is from an inscription that dates to, we have a very precise date about this inscription. So the date is 22 June 736 AD. So this inscription comes from Gujarat, and this is a grant by a person called Jayabhatta IV. So this Jayabhatta IV was a early Gurjar, was a king of early Gurjar dynasty, and he was during this period a vassal or feudatory of the Maitrikas, who were also called the Lord of Vallabhi. So he tells us that he had achieved victory over the Tajikas in the city of the Lord of Vallabhi. So here most scholars are of the opinion that this Tajikas are the Arabs, and the fact that this inscription tells us that he achieved victory over the Tajikas in the city of Lord of Vallabhi tells us that the city of the Lord of Vallabhi was Vallabhi itself. So it appears that Vallabhi was attacked, and the Arabs managed to penetrate into the city of Vallabhi or close to the city of Vallabhi. And finally, these Arabs who had raided or invaded were defeated. Interestingly, for those of you who have listened to the previous talk, which was on Prabandhacintamani, I think they would remember that in Prabandhacintamani there is also this instance where the Malechhas are attacking the city of Vallabhi, and the idols of the different shrines of Vallabhi are flying to different regions to for safety. So although Prabandhacintamani does not talk about the name of the Malechha king is not present, and the ruler is also a different ruler. Prabandhacintamani tells us that this was the ruler who is called Shiladitya, but Shiladitya was a previous ruler who ruled before the coming of the Arabs. But interestingly, that what we can say is that a text which was written around 1306 AD had preserved this memory over the attack of Vallabhi. Or there are some scholars who believe that there were multiple attempts that were made on Vallabhi, because Vallabhi was an important center, and also a rich center. So this was, around 736 AD that we get the first reference of Tajikas. Then after there is another inscription which is it is also a grant by a person called Chalukya Pulakeshi Raja, and it dates to around 739 AD. Now here again we also see that the same term Tajik appears, and this Pulakeshi Raja, who was the feudatory of the Chalukya ruler Vikramaditya II. So this feudatory is also telling us that he had defeated the Tajikas. Now the fact that we have these two important inscriptions, and these important inscriptions are when we date them, they are quite close to each other, suggest that this period from 1724 to the 738 740 was the period where multiple attempts were made by the Arabs to penetrate deep into India. And by the end of by the second half of 8th century, that means after 740 or 750, the Arabs did not really made an attempt to conquer deep into India. They simply stopped. Like we see that there are no major campaigns that were made to conquer India. So they were content with Sindh, but the frontier between Sindh and Al-Hind, as Arab sources called India, was a frontier in which constant struggle used to take place. So if you have to look at it this way, is that the period from this 25-year period, this we can say broadly, this 25-year period was the period of intense struggle between the Arabs and the Indian rulers, and the Indian rulers did manage to to stop the Arab invasions. And after 750, we do not see any major attempts that were made to conquer this region. But interestingly, although in these two inscriptions we have this we get this perception that Arabs were trying to conquer India, but in the Rashtrakuta realm we have also some inscriptions that are favorable to the Tajikas. So for example, there is this inscription which tells us that the Rashtrakuta ruler Indra III, who ruled from 1878 to 1915, so he had appointed a person called Madhumati, and he granted the entire mandal of Samyan to govern. So this Madhumati, according to most scholars, is the Sanskritized version of the Arabic term Muhammad. So here what we can see is that the role of the Tajikas is quite different from the inscriptions, which these are the 8th century inscriptions of North and Western India, where they were more of a raider or aggressor. Now this fact that Rashtrakutas employed Arabs is pretty straightforward when we look at the fact that the Rashtrakutas maintained great relations with Arabs, and the Arabs were main you can say great power in terms of trade. They were a great trading power. So since the Rashtrakutas had great coastlines, they benefited greatly from this whole Arab trade that connected all the different parts of the Indian Ocean. So that is why we see that for the Rashtrakutas, the Tajikas were not considered enemy as the Pratiharas were described by the Arabs. Now, so this is the one term which is Tajika, but Tajika is not the only term that is used. We have terms like Parashika, Garjana, or Garjanak. So Garjan and Garjanak is a Sanskritized version of Ghazni, from Ghazni. So this is Garjan and Garjanak is also sometimes used. Then there are terms like Yavana, Malech, Shak, which is previously also used to describe the outsiders. And the term Musalman for the first time appears in the middle of 13th century. So most of the time before 13th century it was these terms that were used. So I think we should first discuss this term Parasika. So Parasika is not a term that appears when the Arabs came. So like the term Tajika, we see that Tajika first time appears after the invasion of the Arabs. But this is not true of the term Parasika, because in Kalidas's Raghuvams, so Raghuvams tells us that Raghu defeated the armies of the Parasikas. Now some scholars believe that the campaigns of Raghu were modeled after the campaigns of Samudragupta, and these Parasikas were the Persians, and some scholars are of the opinion that Samudragupta invaded the Persian territory, and that is why when Kalidas wrote his Raghuvamsh, he talks about the fact that Raghu defeated the armies of the Parasikas. Now Parasika is a term that used for Persia by the Indians. That is true. But what we see is that when the fall of the Sassanids happened, we see that this term was used to describe the Muslim inhabitants who now who lived in this whole Persian region. And what we also see that sometimes they were called Parasikas, and sometimes Yavan, Malech, Shaka is also used. But interestingly, when you look at Bana's Harsh Charitra, so Bana in his Harsh Charitra talks about Parasikas, and he also talks about Turukshas. And Turuksha is also a term that is used for Muslims. And what we see is that for Bana, these two terms are completely different. So now when we move to the term Turuksha, so I think for those of you who have heard this talk on Kushan, which I gave, so in the Kushanas in the Indian sources are described as Turukshas. And this term Turukshas is a derivative of Tochari or Tocharian, which is a Greek term, or although this is, some scholars debate this, but the region which was, controlled by the Kushanas, which is both banks of Oxus and the region of Balkh or Bactria. So this was the region which is called Tukharistan. And the fact that, so the reason why Indian sources used Turukshas for the Muslims is because what we see is that by the time when this whole area came under the rule of Turks and the Turks has Islamicized, and when they, started entering deep into India after 10th century or the end of the 10th century, we see that, so they were coming from the region of Tukharistan, which was initially controlled by the Kushanas, who were called Turukshas. So since they were also coming from that same place, they were also called Turuksha. So to give you an example, if we look at Raj Tarangani of Kalhan, so for Kalhan, Tibetans and Kushanas are both Turukshas. Then there is also a Sharda inscription from Hund. Hund is a place near Attak. So here we learn that the term Turuksha in the 8th century, because this Sharda inscription from Hund is of 8th century, the term Turuksha is used for the ethnic Turks who had not converted to Islam yet. And this region of Tukharistan has now come under these Turks who were not yet Islamicized. And because of this, the term Turushk is also used for the Turks. And that is what we see. And when we look at our Indian sources, we see that, when this region, the Turks who inhabited this region, when they became Islamicized, and by the end of 10th century AD, we see that, the invasions of the Turks started happening. The term Turuksha is used more often. And that is why most of our inscriptions of the period after 10th century and even our sources, Sanskrit sources, include the term Turuksha quite often. Then there are terms like Yavana and Shaka that is also used. For example, if we are going to look at the text Hammīra-Mahākāvya. Hammīra-Mahākāvya was written in the 14th century AD. So here what you will find that the term Malech and Turushka appears, but the most common term is Shaka, and Yavan also is sometimes used. So here you can see, how these Mlech, Shaka, Yavana, Turushk are sometimes interchangeably used. But interestingly, when we look at Kashmir and particularly Kalhan's Raj Tarangani, here we have the usual terms like Turushka, Yavana, Shaka. But apart from this, there is also this term called Mausala. Mausala is an interesting term because it is a derivative of the term Musalman, and it is used for the Muslim settlers and the converts also. But this is a later text. This was composed around the 15th century AD. Now, another important inscription which I think we should know about, and most of the scholars who quote this inscription, this is an important inscription, and this inscription is in Delhi, and it's called Palam, Palam Baoli inscription, and this inscription dates back to around 1276 AD. So this inscription tells us about the kingdom of Shri Hammīra-Mahākāvya. Ghayasamdin is none other than Ghiyasuddin Balban. So this was the period during which Delhi was ruled by Ghiyasuddin Balban. So what we see is that this is a long inscription, but I think the last passage of this inscription is quite important. So I will just quote the last passage of this inscription, and I quote, "The earth being now supported by this sovereign, Shesh, altogether forsaking his duty of supporting the weight of the globe, has betaken himself to the great bed of Vishnu, and Vishnu himself, for the sake of protection, taking Lakshmi on his breast and relinquishing all worries, sleeps in peace on the ocean of milk." So here you can see how, this inscription describes the sovereign, who is Ghiyasuddin Balban. And this is a Sanskrit inscription. Now, some scholars have argued that, the perception of Muslims or the Turks is different when you read this inscription. From this inscription, you can learn that there was a different perception of the Turkish rule as we believe. But if we have to look at it this way, for example, if you have to first consider that this inscription was written close to Delhi, and this is a Baoli. So Baoli is not a private structure which you build in your home. This is a public structure which everybody can see. And the fact that, the ruler who ruled this region, whose center was this region, he was praised in this inscription, is, I think, should not be, we should not think too much about it, because it is quite obvious that he would be praised. Because if suppose this person who wrote this inscription started criticizing this person, this ruler Balban, I don't think Balban would like it that much. And we should also consider the fact that there is this, difference between what you write or what you say in public and what you say in private. So here also the fact that this inscription, which everybody can see, was written, and here this Ghayasamdin or Ghiyasuddin Balban was praised, should not be, we should not think that this would mean much. That is what I believe. Now, coming back to this whole terminologies that were used by our sources, by Sanskrit sources. So some scholars, particularly B.D. Chattopadhyaya, he argues that, the fact that Yavan, Malech, Shak, Turushk, all of these terms which are used for Muslims is also used for outsiders who had come before the arrival of Muslims, suggests that for the Indian sources, there was no real difference between the Muslims who came after 8th century or around 8th century and the other foreigners who came before Muslims. So basically what he is arguing is that when for the Sanskrit sources, both of these outsiders, if we want to separate them, they were not really different from each other in the eyes of Sanskrit sources. They were both same. And what he argues is that for the Sanskrit sources, the main concern was that both of these foreigners were against the moral social order. So this moral social order is basically the Varnashram Dharma. So the fact that the early foreigners, Malechhas, were also against this Varnashram Dharma and they destroyed this whole social order. And these Yavanas, Shakas who came after 8th century, they also destroyed the moral social order. For the Sanskrit sources, it is only this fact that is important. So this is what they basically argue. Now, for us, we can look at this in two different ways. For I think when you read sources, particularly Sanskrit sources from 12th century onwards, it is true that inscriptions, when we are talking about the inscriptions where Tajikas are mentioned, are not described as someone who is of a different religion. And which I think would make sense, because in inscription, they were more concerned with telling us that they destroyed this people, and this people. And also we should also consider the fact that these inscriptions that were written, for example, the two inscriptions which I had talked about, were written in 736 AD and in 739 AD. So it would be, I think it would be hard for us to imagine that during this short period of time, the Indians or the Indian rulers were able to get the, whole idea of who these Tajikas were, what was their, religious views. And even in the 11th century, we see that, there are some characteristics that these sources were able to pick, but they did not really talk about the religion of these Yavanas, Shakas. And this is not anything new. When you read the early Indian sources, when they talk about Yavanas, they also didn't talk about the religious aspects of the Yavanas or Shakas or Pahlavas. The Indo-Parthians were called Pahlavas. So here also we see that, there is no discussion of any religious nature of these Turkish and Arabic rulers who were invading. And another thing we should also consider is that our experience, the present experience of any society or any individual, most of the time we perceive our present experience through the experience of our past. So when these Indian sources were taking the terminology that were used in early Indian texts, they were basically using the terminology to describe foreigners that were used by their predecessors. So I think no culture would invent a particularly new terminology to describe someone when there is already a terminology that is present. But even if we say that, the terminologies that were used by the Indian sources of early medieval period use the same terminology that were used for the early foreigners, but we can also see that, there are some new differences, or there are some different qualities that are present in these sources. For example, if we are talking about a text called Prithviraj Vijay, Prithviraj Vijay is the most important text when we are talking about Prithviraj Chauhan, because this was written during the reign of Prithviraj Chauhan, and it is a contemporary text. But the problem with this text is that this is not translated in English. There is a basic summary is present in English by a scholar called Harbilas Prasad. I think that is the name. But the Hindi translation is also not available online. It is out of stock. But in a article by Sheldon Pollock, he has translated some passages from Prithviraj Vijay. And Prithviraj Vijay was written by a Kashmiri Pandit So in these passages, Muhammad Gauri, for the author of Prithviraj Vijay, the term Gauri, he uses this term to suggest that this means that they were killer of cows. So Gauri is converted into a Sanskrit word, which is go and Ari. So go means guy, cow, and Ari means enemy. So cow's enemy. So the term Gauri literally means for Prithviraj Vijay, the enemy of the cows. So these particular qualities, were not present in early descriptions of foreigners that came before the arrival of the Arabs and the Turks. Another important point which we see is that the reference to temple desecration. Since Prithviraj Vijay is not, translated, we cannot see whether here also there are some description of temple being destroyed. But when we look at Prabandhacintamani, which was written around 1306 AD, here we see that there are a indirect reference where we are told that Malicha army has destroyed had surrounded the city of Vallabhi, and the idols from the different shrines of Vallabhi are going to different places. They were flying to different places so to seek refuge. And another interesting passage from this same instance tells us that the deity of the city, who is I think Amba, is crying. She is having a conversation with Lord Vardhaman, and she is crying and telling Lord Vardhaman that now the water will turn red. So this is an indirect reference. We are not told why this would happen, but we can guess that since the armies of the Malichas have surrounded the city of Vallabhi, the ongoing bloodshed and destruction would cause the turning of water into blood. So this is an indirect reference. Then if you read Hammīra-Mahākāvya, here the terms are more explicit. For example, when this text describes Shihabuddin Gauri, this text tells us that after defeating the rulers, he is now destroying the temples. And then there is this explicit term which is used in Hammīra-Mahākāvya, which is Gau Bhakshak Shaka. So Shaka is used for for Shihabuddin Gauri and the Turks, and Go Bhakshak means cow eater, or so beef eater. So this is another important reference. Then after the death of Hammīr, the Chauhan ruler, we are also told that when Hammīr, after the death of Hammīr, the author is telling us that now Hammīr, you are gone. The Yavanas or the Shakas are killing the cows and they are defiling the sacred ponds. So these are important reference where we can see that the perception of the Turks and the Arabs was not exactly same as the perception of early foreigners like Indo-Scythians, Indo-Greeks or Indo-Parthians were. Then particularly we are talking about Prabandhacintamani and Hammīra-Mahākāvya. There is also the reference that the Muslims did not, they had negative attitude towards eating of pork. Because in Prabandhacintamani, we are told that, when Prithviraj was captured by the Malicha king, the text does not talk about the name, does not tell us the name of the Malicha king. But we are told that after this capture, the Malicha king and Prithviraj goes to the palace of Prithviraj, and here the Malicha king sees that on the walls of Prithviraj palace, Malicha kings are depicted getting killed by pigs. So this description, makes the Malicha king very angry, and he then and there cuts off the head of Prithviraj. So, the fact that this description is present in Prabandhacintamani tells us that the author was somehow aware of the fact that, pork or pig was not particularly, was looked down by the Muslims. And in Hammīra-Mahākāvya, the reference is more straightforward. So we are told that, one ambassador of King Sultan Alauddin Khilji goes to Hammīr Chauhan's court, and Hammīr Chauhan tells him that the text also describes the two generals of Alauddin Khilji, who is the text tells us that the text calls Ulugh Khan, and Nusrat Khan is called Nusrat Khan. So Ulugh Khan and Nusrat Khan, Hammīr tells this ambassador that he would make sure that these two generals would eat pork. So this is a threat or an insult by Hammīr. Now, the fact that, these two the descriptions suggest that the writers of Indian sources were aware of the differences between these two different groups, and the fact that there was also some instances of temple desecration which is present in these two texts. For me, it suggests that there was a slight difference when the perception of the Arabs and the Turks is compared when we compared the perception of the Turks and the Arabs and early foreigners who came to India before the arrival of the Arabs. So this is, I think, this is the broad overview of the perception of early Sanskrit sources. I have not included Prithviraj Raso because it is a later text written around 16th century. So then there are more texts which I have not included. This is just a overview.